Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Ken Seigneurie. This public event, as we like to call it, rather than lecture, is jointly sponsored with CASA, the Center for American Studies and Research. Am I right? Yes. And Professor Seigneurie is going to speak to us about world literature and post-liberal norm, which will primarily focus on the post-liberal world, as he calls it, in which we find ourselves, which still have to deal both in politics and in culture and in politics, with pluralism or diversity, plurality, diversity, and unity. And I think this would be the main question that Professor Seigneurie will try to discuss in his lecture. Professor Seigneurie is presently the Edward Said Chair of American Studies at KSAR AUB. But his permanent position is in Canada. He's a professor of world literature in the Simon Fraser University in Burnaby, in British Columbia. So he's on leave from his university for a year or two.
Just one, alas.
And we're very pleased at AUB to have him. He's no stranger to Lebanon. He knows our country very well. He's taught in many universities, Université Saint-Joseph, Balaman University, Lebanese American University, for many, many years. And as a specialist in comparative literature, has developed a great interest in modern Arabic literature. He knows more particularly Lebanese recent literature extremely well and has written extensively about it. He's written about Naguib Mahfouz as well and many others. He's trained obviously in comparative literature, but previously in English literature. He has a major work in progress, that is the Wiley-Blackwell Companion to World Literature, which is a gigantic task that he's masterminding. He's the general editor. It's a 5-volume, 1.5 million words that brings 297 contributors. And it's due June 2018?
October 2019.
October 2019, yeah. So we'll have to be patient another year. I won't go through his curriculum vitae. It's enough to say that he's a scholar in the best sense. He's worked on a variety of subjects, not just comparative literature, but touching on other issues, sociology of knowledge, for example, history of ideas. And his lecture, I think, reflects the diversity of his intellectual interests and experiences. I've known Ken for quite a while, and I'm at a personal level, I'm very pleased to introduce a friend. I'd known him before he started his academic career, at a time where he was a journalist, so he had his feet in the real world, and I'm sure that his work as a journalist has in some way informed his work in academia. Without further ado, I'm join me in welcoming Professor Seigneurie.
Thank you very much, Tarek, for this very generous introduction. I'd first like to express my gratitude to Amy Zenger, Director of the El Walid bin Talal Center for American Studies and Research, for the warm welcome she and her colleagues and staff have extended to me this year and this evening. And in the same breath, I'd like to thank Tarek and the Aysam Faris Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs for co-sponsoring with KSAR this evening's talk. Now, I have the PowerPoint up there. I hope you're not waiting for, great pyrotechnics in the realm of, imagery. It ain't going to happen. It's basically a kind of way of following the argument through simply, and no need to be distracted by it. So, when Tarek proposed a joint IFI-KSAR talk last fall, the idea appealed to me for its cross-disciplinarity. I began thinking about how my field of world literature related to the socio-economic doctrine of neoliberalism. But that led me down a path of little or no resistance. Many a cogent critique of neoliberalism already exists, and I have nothing to add to them. On the other hand, I have a growing sense that much of the fire directed at neoliberalism is a way of directing attention away from the much more venerable tradition of liberalism. But what really set me to thinking about liberalism are the unnuanced celebrations of Enlightenment values one reads about in Steven Pinker and elsewhere. And when, in actuality, I think those values are not immune to critique themselves. Yet at the same time, like most of us here, I am a product and beneficiary of the liberal humanist tradition. So the idea of studying liberalism and world literature became an ideal research topic, one that allows me to pit my suspicions about liberalism against my hopes about world literature. I approach liberalism from the standpoint of its solution to an old problem, that of unity and diversity. After all, the unity of mankind is not what it used to be. Whither the days of yore, when we all belonged to the same moral world, in which brotherhood and respect for reasonable order reigned. We moderns seldom find ourselves indulging in such ubi sunt sentiments unironically. We detect the telltale whiff of coercion in the phrase, the same moral world, and the quashing of diversity in respect for reasonable order, and of course, identify gendered normativity in mankind and brotherhood. And yet these concepts are all traceable to the 18th century liberal convictions around equality and brotherhood. Even today, we cannot live without a sense of the unity of humankind. I can appeal for respect for my particular individuality only from those who I recognize are like me. Otherwise, I might as well be appealing for respect from a moth or a mosquito. Their absolute otherness leaves no common ground for my appeal. They and I occupy two different worlds, and when these worlds overlap, there can only be indifference, exploitation, or violence, which is arguably where we are today, struggling with multiple worlds. So a world is characterized by the interrelations of its members within a meaningful degree of order and unity. In any world, some diversities are allowed to flourish. Others are permitted, and still others are checked. I shall argue here that the world of modern liberalism, which has provided the framework for thinking about unity and diversity for 250 years, is now collapsing. My second major claim will be that world literature can help us explore new ways to face the old problem of unity and diversity, and thereby meet the challenge of extremisms. As a political movement, liberalism emerged in response to the 17th century European wars of religion that had devastated the continent. And by the late 18th century, the great thinkers of liberalism, from Locke to Kant, had established its principles of freedom of conscience, free speech, free markets, political pluralism, and equal opportunity. The role of these ideas at the heart of the American and French revolutions, and indeed of modernity as such, needs no demonstration. Since then, liberalism has adapted to changing conditions, such that today it is the most widespread moral and political theory on the planet. Tonight, we'll concentrate on only one among several distinguishing characteristics of liberal thought. In 1689, toward the end of 150 years of violent religious struggle in Europe, John Locke published his essay concerning human understanding. We all know about his tabula rasa, the notion that human beings are not born with innate ideas, but are rather a blank slate at birth. The concept I'm interested in is related to the tabula rasa. Scholars call it Locke's doctrine of suspension, and it states that humans have, I quote, power to suspend the execution and satisfaction of desires, which enables us to consider the objects of the various desires that compete in our minds and to examine them on all sides and weigh them with others, end quote. While the idea of weighing the pros and cons of an idea is doubtless a human universal, the doctrine of suspension brings with it a particular vision of the mind. How do we characterize the human mind when it is suspending judgment and examining its object? For Locke, it becomes as close to a tabula rasa as possible. I propose we think of the mind in this state as a blank space, empty of prejudice as it reasons over its object in complete freedom. No religion, no king, no clan, no family, no extraneous ideas to clutter up the thought processes of reason. One can see how such an arena of thought would be appealing after 150 years of bitter struggle among diverse groups that could not reach consensus among themselves on any unity-providing authority. After Locke, henceforth, at the apex of the pyramid of discourses of unity, there would be no religious doctrine, no naturalized loyalty to the king, no family or ancestral affiliations. Instead, there would be nothing. A glorious psychological and social blank space ruled only by a method, reason, and permitting the free development of the human spirit. Such remains the dream of liberalism that we know today, whether it be the socially progressive liberalism that uses the blank space to think about the advancement of humanity according to the principles of freedom and equality for all, or classical liberalism that sees the blank space as an open field to think about the advancement of humanity according to the principle of free enterprise, unencumbered by the state. The blank space of the mind has a corollary, the arena of public debate in parliaments, in print, in video, online and social media, coffee houses, and academic get-togethers such as this one. Underscoring the blankness of this space, Alan Ryan, a prominent contemporary liberal theorist, notes that, I quote, liberalism is well defined in negative terms. Its central commitment, liberty, is a negative notion. To be free is to not be in jail, not bound to a particular occupation, not excluded from the franchise, and so on, end quote. We might add, not bound to any ideas that are not freely chosen. The crisis of liberalism today may be regarded according to how this metaphor concept of the blank space Most critiques of liberalism, from the left and from the right, have traditionally disputed the possibility of an empty arena of free thought, arguing that it is a naive figment. According to the leftist critique, whether you call it blue sky thinking, a level playing field, or the public arena, the blank space serves only to conceal or mystify the very real structures of reactionary thought and practice that prevent human progress. The leftists, therefore, might claim that liberalism is even worse than conservatism, as one must demystify the fog of liberal piety around so-called free thought before tackling the problem of structural inequalities. The right, too, notes that the blank space of reason is a myth. No actual human being is without communal obligations, identities, whether they be family, religion, nation, corporation, etc. All inflect one's exercise of reason. But of course, for the conservative right, continuity, community, tradition, and hierarchy are organic elements of the good society, not reactionary structures to be overthrown. Now, one would have thought that the so-called triumph of democratic liberalism in 1991 would have blunted these critiques. After all, liberalism's blank spaces, or arenas of free thought in the mind and in society, positively ballooned once communist doctrine evaporated from 15 Soviet republics, 8 East European states, and numerous nations in the developing world. Even for the Western democracies, it was no longer necessary to situate thinking with respect to illiberal East or liberal West, as globalization spread and liberalism became, in principle, almost ubiquitous the world over. Then, an even more momentous liberal triumph came a decade and a half later with the development of the Web 2.0 world. Social media freed thought and public discourse from gatekeepers in print and broadcast media and from religious, corporate, and political institutions. Suddenly, exploring and choosing religious, ideological, gender sexual, even racial identities went from utopia to human right. Crucially, however, social class became an even more ironclad barrier, as if the fluidity of these other identities were a consolation prize for the increasingly inequitable economic world. In theory, then, Web 2.0 expanded the arena of liberal free thought to the limits of consciousness itself. If you could think it, you could live it and debate it 24/7 in cyberspace. Arenas do not expand easily. Bubbles do. The expansion of liberalism was more like the expansion of a bubble than a conscientiously reconstructed arena. In the physical world, when the pressure inside a bubble exceeds its maximum tensile strength, the membrane ruptures and the bubble collapses. We talk about bubbles in economics too. But the blank space of liberalism is also something of a bubble. The membrane that encloses free thought in liberalism is reason, according to liberals, and socio-political structures, according to the left and conservatives alike. Yet even liberals today have to admit that rigid corporate, religious, and political frameworks helped reason keep the bubble intact before the digital age. Today, the proliferation of illiberal and extremist ideologies stretches the liberal bubble to the point where many liberals themselves beg for restrictions. Violent extremisms, sexual depravity, social intimidation, false and tendentious information all exert pressure on liberalism's overextended bubble. At this point in history of liberalism, after 250 years of expanding rights and freedoms, to apply broad and meaningful limits to liberal prerogatives and still call it liberalism would vindicate the leftist critique that liberal verbiage yet again veils systemic authority. Then again, If limits on the rights and freedoms of the Web 2.0 are not forthcoming, it vindicates the conservative critique that liberalism leads to chaos and that only tradition and authority can be relied on. The third and most likely option, a patchwork of punctual half measures aimed at pleasing both sides, will in all likelihood take us further from any meaningful liberalism to yield a state and corporate liberalism akin to Chinese market communism. It would in turn fuel the trend toward ever greater cynicism and feed the pure and passionate extremisms that offer alternatives. At this point, I hope I've demonstrated that liberalism, the political and ethical theory the modern world has been living by for the past 2.5 centuries, is in trouble. Not for the first time, to be sure, but perhaps for the last. I also hope it is at least plausible that the current scramble to salvage liberal freedoms under the threat of bare-knuckle identitarianisms of the right and left is forlorn. It remains for me to make good on what doubtless appears to be an outlandish claim, that world literature can point to a new way of facing the age-old problem of unity and diversity as we plunge into a post-liberal world. The failing fortunes of liberalism seem to throw us onto the horns of a dilemma of either left or right-wing thinking, both of which seek to fill the blank space of free thought with simple certitudes that are attractive to broad swaths of humanity, especially in a Web 2.0 environment. Yet other ways of thinking do exist. Instead of dreading the imminent collapse of the liberal bubble, as we, to quote Cavafy, wait for the barbarians, let's look at the space at what it arguably always was, a strategic reduction of complex humanity into monovalent rationalism. By skimming the passion off the bloody religious conflicts, liberal thought reduced them, and human complexity at the same time, to a manageable, disenchanted contest of ideas. While it opened a space for rationality, it was arguably not the bold Promethean freeing of human potentiality that we've been celebrating for centuries now, but rather a fearful truncating of full humanity in order to solve the pressing problem of unity and diversity. Solutions sometimes become problems themselves, and periodically since the 18th century, in an ever-intensifying return of the repressed scenario, full humanity in all its chaotic diversity bursts forth and dares us to face it with courage. Romanticism was, of course, a conscious bringing into question of liberal Enlightenment certitudes, but so arguably was the anti-colonial struggle against the Enlightenment's quashing of cultural identity in the name of reason. And so also was European modernism's revolt against modernity, etc. So as full humanity bursts forth today in the form of passionate identitarianisms, again we face, I quote, a politically divided age engaged in incessant conflicts, the misery caused by wars and revolutions accompanied by simultaneous prosperity elsewhere. End quote. That's not a contemporary pundit describing the globalized world of today, but Karl Jaspers describing the socio-political conditions of the year 800 before the Common Era in China, South Asia, and the Levant. We shall return to Jaspers in a minute. Having, I hope, sown doubt about the viability of the liberal solution to the problem of unity and diversity, I'll try to make good on the claim that attending to world literature can point the way to facing the post-liberal world. The idea of world literature that we'll deal with today is not theoretical. It is a precise corpus consisting of 300 literary and cultural topics that I've had the privilege and responsibility to select, along with 5 other editors and numerous assistants, for a work that will be known as the Wiley-Blackwell Companion to World Literature. The project is massive, 5 volumes, 1.5 million words, hundreds of contributors hailing from more than 24 countries. Each essay deals with one author or work, from Gilgamesh to Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and all are arranged under 36 literary or sociocultural topics, each with its own explanatory essay. As reference works goes, it is among the more serious efforts to understand humanity's literary heritage cross-culturally and trans-historically. On the other hand, as big as it is, this project is embarrassingly incomplete and skewed. Literatures from hundreds of language cultures, even major living ones such as Romanian and Tagalog, go unrepresented. Other language cultures such as Vietnamese and the entirety of pre-Columbian Mesoamerica count just one essay each. And even though we strive for gender balance and ethnic inclusiveness on the editorial board and among contributors, it's also the case that our editors and most of our contributors have been trained in secular institutions on the Euro-North American model, such as this one. Then there's our academic elitism that also artificially limits our idea of world literature. Among our topics, we have Constantin Cavafy and Roberto Bolaño, both celebrated in Western universities nowadays, but no Agatha Christie, no John Steinbeck, whose books are ubiquitous the world over. Geography influences our choices as well. If this project were conceived in Istanbul, Pierre Loti, a Turkish favorite, would probably figure in it. And if it were published in Beijing, Pearl S. Buck would be there for sure. Finally, we have moral criteria, texts with deep and long-standing influence, such as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and Sayyid Qutb's Milestones, do not have a place. Yet other potentially controversial figures are included, such as Rudyard Kipling and Yasunari Kawabata, notwithstanding their endorsement of British colonialism and Japanese fascism, respectively. Each inclusion is the product of, I dare say, reasoned debate, not irrefutable logic. And I mention all this because when we talk about world literature, make no mistake, we are talking about a world, one that is shot through with grossly unequal power relations. This project gestures toward the unity of humankind, but it is produced by particular individuals under particular conditions. And so, while we have done everything we can so that the companion will remain fresh and relevant for eons of time, it is, like all worlds, structured by its boundaries, and its boundaries are not natural, but human-made. Now let's begin examining our object of study, world literature as represented in these 300 essays. For Volume 1, covering the period from the third millennium before the Common Era to the year 600 of the Common Era, consider some of the topics that I've put on the board. Confucius, the I Ching, Lao Tzu, Theragatha, the Upanishads, Rig Veda, the Gathas, Homer, Hesiod, Socrates, Plato, and the Tanakh, or Hebrew Bible. These topics, and others like them, account for more than half of the 45 topics in Volume 1. All deal with ethics and the place of human beings in the physical and spiritual cosmos. You will have noticed also that these texts come from ancient China, India, Persia, Greece, and Palestine, and that the three great regions represented here, East Asia, South Asia, and Southeastern Europe and the Middle East, all developed independently of each other. That's much of the ancient world, but not all of it. And no lack of honor is implied toward Africa, Australia, Europe outside of Greece, or the pre-Columbian American civilizations. In world literature, a gain for one part of humanity must be a gain for all, or it wouldn't be part of world literature. It would be national or ethnic or regional. Returning to these ancient texts, Karl Jaspers in 1949 noticed that all of the texts mentioned, and plenty of others, were produced in a 600-year period between 800 and 200 before the Common Era. That is, the period began about 2,200 years after the emergence of writing and ended about 2,200 years before today. Jaspers was by no means the first to notice the apparent coincidence of so many texts related to these topics during this relatively short period, but he was the first to present a serious theory of what he called the Axial Age. Jaspers wrote that in the period around 500 BC, I quote, "We meet with the most deep-cut dividing line in history. Man as we know him today came into being. What is new about this age in all three areas of the world is that man becomes conscious of being as a whole, of himself and his limitations. He experiences the terror of the world and his own powerlessness. He asks radical questions. Face to face with the void, he strives for liberation and redemption. By consciously recognizing his limits, he sets himself the highest goals. He experiences absoluteness in the depths of selfhood and in the lucidity of transcendence." End quote. Jaspers presents the Axial Age as an objective, empirical fact of history and human development, then goes on to theorize its origins by focusing on the preconditions that existed in Chinese, Indian, Persian, Greek, and Hebrew civilizations of the time. Most had been influenced by one of the great ancient river civilizations that had emerged from 3,500 to 1,700 before the Common Era. Each was entering by the year 800 BCE, not a golden age of power and stability, but, I quote, "a politically divided age engaged in incessant conflicts, the misery caused by wars and revolutions, accompanied by simultaneous prosperity elsewhere. And since destruction was neither universal nor radical, a questioning of previously existing conditions." End quote. That, of course, sounds familiar. In this environment, the development of universal, ethical, spiritual systems flourished. And in case you're interested, Christianity and Islam were, for Jaspers, offshoots of the Axial Age, which is, again, not to imply mere derivativeness, but elaborations from a common trunk. Jaspers' thesis about the Axial Age, once almost forgotten, has recently been the object of renewed interest and controversy. From my standpoint, as an editor of a reference book devoted to literature, I find it noteworthy that our choice of texts and authors were congruent with those of Jaspers, identified as being central to the Axial Age. We had no a priori interest in ethics or transcendence, only in creative literature that has traveled, i.e., in texts that appeal to the imagination of readers across time and geographical linguistic boundaries. I see our choices, therefore, as something of an independent endorsement from a literary standpoint of the Axial Age thesis. Let's consider also that ethical spiritual texts do not make up the entirety of Volume 1. World literature from the 3rd millennium to BCE to 600 of the Common Era also includes Sappho's love poetry, Apuleius' Metamorphoses, better known as the Golden Ass, the passionate extremes of Greek tragedy, the Indian Panchatantra, the Silapathekaram, don't ask me to say it again, Kalidasa's Shakuntala, Chinese lyric poetry, and the long narrative poem, Southeast Fly the Peacocks, the story of a married couple forced to separate by the husband's mother, leading the wife to drown herself and the husband to hang himself. These and other texts in Volume 1 form a block of their own that conveys a sense not of ethical unity of humankind, but of the irreducible quirkiness of desire and human individuality that often subvert, as in Southeast Fly the Peacocks, ethical norms. So we see in ancient world literature two major literary impulses, one ethical and transcendent, and the other grounded in the exploration of fleshly desire in all its forms. I don't want to play up a polarity here. After all, many of these texts deal to some extent with both sides of the question. Think of Vatsyayana's Kama Sutra and the Song of Songs, for example. But by identifying the dual postulates, such as these, suggests an abiding, worldwide literary interest in exploring what William Faulkner famously called the human heart in conflict with itself. Now that we've established these two broad currents, let's move into Volume 2, World Literature from 601 to 1450. Here we see the development of the literatures relating to the Christian and Islamic offshoots of the Axial Age. Around the year 1000, the ethical, spiritual, and personal erotic currents often unite in mystical elaborations. Ibn Arabi, Jalaluddin Rumi, Meister Eckhart, Christine de Pizan, and in East Asia, the great Tang Dynasty poets. In Japan, there's Hanshan. In South Asia, Mirabai. Yet at the same time, we see the resurgence of a literature that had been conspicuously muted during the Axial Age. One that celebrates a different kind of unity, that of empire. Indeed, Jaspers notes that the Axial Age had been an interregnum between two ages of great empires. By the 15th century, the literature of empire, the royal court, and proto-national communities flourished throughout the world, striving to promote unity, not by stressing the individual's place in the cosmos as in the Axial Age, but by stressing the individual's place in political and social groupings that are associated with the Axial Age belief systems. In this way, creative literature sought to suture the ideal worlds of Axial Age spirituality into spatial coordinates. Think here of Journey to the West in Ming Dynasty China, the Kokinshu in Japan, the Ramakaritmanas in Mughal India, the Shahnameh in Persia, the Kebra Nagast in Ethiopia, the Nibelungenlied in Germany, the Chanson de Roland in France, the Lusiad by Camões in Portugal. In each case, literature takes a given cultural and political ambit, a world, and posits an Axial Age unity of humankind within it. By the time we get into Volume 3, World Literature from 1451 to 1770, the current of fleshly desire that had been most often sublimated into mysticism in Volume 2 returns to earth, as it were, and intensely personal literature flourishes, especially in Europe, but not exclusively. The secularized individual consciousness of Rabelais, Montaigne, Rousseau, and the rise of the modern novel in Cervantes, Defoe, and Richardson have counterparts in China, where The Plum in the Golden Vase, The Story of the Stone are the great novelistic examples, and also The Story of the Western Wing and Four Cries of a Gibbon in dramatic literature. Religious and spiritual literature still exists. Think of Kabir in India, Martin Luther, Teresa of Avila, and Milton in Europe, but the center of gravity in the human psyche is veering into secular literature of this world, a world which after 1492 expands by an entire hemisphere. Spatiality in its sheer materiality imposes itself, and the unity of humankind becomes more secularized than spiritual in the literature of travel, with Ibn Battuta and Marco Polo being only the most famous examples. Likewise, the literatures of colonialism and rising national consciousness shed much, but not all, of the Axial Age spiritual impulse. Perhaps the best example of the secularized will to unity comes in the rise of encyclopedism, which is specifically focused on intellectually circumscribing the known world and implicitly declaring the spiritual world as irrelevant. In Volume 4, World Literature from 1779 to 1919, think here of the realist novel, of course, but also the literatures of human rights, slave narratives, gender rights, the colonial encounter, social justice, and ethnic national rights. Whereas the Axial Age texts sought to grasp the ethical and ontological place of humankind in the cosmos, these texts carve out subworlds in a spatialized and rationalized world. the liberal Enlightenment principles of self-determination and abstract rights sweeps across the planet. At the same time, what else do we see during this period? An explosion of fairy tales throughout the world, Gothic fantasy and horror, Oriental fantasy, the rise of science fiction, and a quantum aesthetic shift by the time of European modernism, all of which stand in stark contrast to the ordering subjective mind characteristic of the realist genres. One could do worse than to consider this florid growth of fantasy literature as an aesthetic compensation for the positivistic unity imposed by liberal subjectivity. In which case, we see that the cosmic imperatives of transcendent unity and human diversity that we saw in Axial Age literature has been gradually funneled down into the subjective world of rationalized unities and fantasy. And this reduction of the cosmos to the subjective mind has only intensified since the emergence of the digital age. Think of The Truman Show, The Matrix, The Black Mirror, not to mention your nephew's relation to cyberspace. What can we take away from this cursory walk through the history of world literature? The liberal consensus around unity, which is considered rational, and diversity, which is considered mere content inside the bubble, is historical and not necessarily preferable to others. Combined with our earlier conclusion that liberalism's rational bubble is arguably rupturing, the increasingly mind-centered, not to say solipsistic trend points to a post-liberal norm characterized by a multiplicity of smaller, more individualized worlds within ever weaker social unities. The more unities are self-centered, the more our subjective worlds look to each other like those of moths and mosquitoes, utterly alien. The implication of such conclusions are not trivial. For one thing, once we take on board the fact that the imperatives of unity and diversity are transhistorical, we can face extremisms, not from the point of a bubble associated with one tradition, but from the Archimedean point of human anthropology. The appeal of populist and sectarian extremisms wanes if the debate about unity and diversity can be decoupled from its association with identities, including and especially that of liberalism. Second, the concept of world literature takes one world as axiomatic and therefore cannot deal in a priori exclusions of the kind that one finds in national or ethnic or regional literatures. The exclusions of world literature are punctual and open to critique. That is to say, we have to justify the exclusion of Agatha Christie, and one can imagine bringing her back at some point. So world literature's explicit foundation in common humanity is commensurate with the globalized Web 2.0 world that provides common media and discursive structures for the entire planet. The great danger of both world literature and the web, of course, is homogenization, whereby the democratization of the web and of the world leads to a one world that is tasteless, colorless, featureless, a perfectly frictionless lowest common denominator for commodity exchange that smooths the way for corporate coercion. In 2 words, airport culture. Gayatri Spivak, Emily Apter, Mariano Siskin, Graham Huggan, and the periodical N+1 are among those who have cogently articulated this argument, but none recognize that if world literature were to degenerate into airport culture, it would be because it will have allowed itself to become subsumed under the political economic system of liberalism. Nor is world literature simply another meta-discourse seeking to situate itself above liberalism. Briefly, it is an attentiveness to reading cross-culturally, precisely in order to be attuned to different worldviews. Let's see how this plays out concretely. World literature encourages us to dare to approach the other, to read beyond our cultural limits on the other's terms, inasmuch as this is possible. So here's a Chinese poem. I think it illustrates what world literature can and cannot do, thanks in part to the web. I did not have to pore over a dozen books in the library to find this poem, and learned that it was probably composed in the 5th century before the Common Era, and first edited by Confucius. So let's read it briefly here. In the wilds is a dead river deer. White rushes wrap her. A lady yearns for someone dear. A fine man seduces her. In the woods are clustered bushes, and in the wilds a river deer is dead and wrapped up in white rushes. There's a lady as fine as jade. Oh, slow down, don't be so harsh. Let go of my girdle's sash. Shh, you'll make the dog bark. In the wilds is a dead river deer comes from the Shijing, the book of odes. It apparently has little to do with axial age concerns, even though it falls right in the middle of it and is associated with one of its most prominent figures. Among the many things we can do now is to swiftly find and compare dozens of translations of this famous poem. Imagine what we would have done 20 years ago. Hey, Serene, I just got back from a 2-week trip to London where I was able to dig up and copy 9 different versions of the poem in the British Library. So world literature allows us to reassess and appreciate translation. Comparing translations, however, is not enough, as we also need a sense of contextual and philological information in order to choose. And here again, the web has made our job much, much easier. And finally, with the web, we can more easily seek collaborative support from Chinese speakers and experts worldwide. Best case scenario from 30 years ago? Hey, David, Longxi's letter finally arrived from Hong Kong after 2 months. Okay? So, whoops. So what I've got here is that this is just wonderful. We can find the Chinese, and then, if you just read this, it's kind of funny, but it's also really, really quite interesting, easy to find. So in an afternoon of finding a text and context on the web, we're ready to read. This version of the Dead River Deer pleases me most for its repetitions and near rhymes, even if I wish the translator had dropped girdles in the penultimate line. And right away, we realize that to read this text is to face otherness. Arthur Waley, the great early 20th century translator, writes, if Chinese peasants would find a deer in the woods that has died, they would cover it with rushes as a sign of respect. So the poem begins in reverence, then brusquely juxtaposes a lady's desire as she yearns for someone dear. Few among us today would associate a dead animal and desire, yet we can train our imagination to see the femininity of the deer, which most translations emphasize by calling it a doe, and the care with which it is covered. Still, the image of death and a desiring woman wrapped together, if you will, puts us off. The poem also features a literary technique common in Chinese but not in English. It's called the hsing, and it is defined as a situation or set of events evoking another situation, the two being understood to entertain a metaphoric relationship, but the point of comparison remains unspecified. So we're dealing with a text that is rather far from the literary world which we are familiar with in terms of both imagery and technique. And yet, even though associating dead animals and romance is not part of our cultural background, and even though the hsing is not a technique we are familiar with, for a moment, we stop and reflect. We quit the hurly-burly of the world and let ourselves peer into the palimpsestic layers of our minds as we read. We recall vaguely John Donne and other Renaissance metaphysical poets, punning on orgasm and death. We remember Rumi's yoking of love and death, and we may remember even a quote or two from Georges Bataille. And as far as the hsing goes, Ezra Pound, we realize, schooled us in this technique in a station at the Metro. So, by exercising our imagination and memory, by the end of the second stanza, somewhat to our surprise, the dead doe-desiring woman begin to make sense together. And then in the last stanza, the text shifts to speak only of the woman and her lover. Yet, we cannot help but read the dead deer and the woman together, just as we see the afterimage of a bulb in a dark room after we turn the light off. We read her warning to her tempestuous lover to let go of her sash, lest the dog bark, as simultaneously a warning against uncovering the dead deer. And then it dawns on us, we go slow and reverentially in lovemaking. Not because if we don't, somebody will accuse us of sexual harassment according to liberalism's rational law of individual rights, but because lovemaking as the epitome of life is intimately linked to death and should be treated with the same reverence. Failing which, we awaken the dog, or more precisely, our bestial nature. And we know all this, don't we? Because despite 250 years of Enlightenment hyper-rationality and its best efforts to denigrate other ways of being in the world, ours remains an Axial Age civilization. The poem shows us how the imperatives of cosmic unity and our quirky, recalcitrant humanity can be integrated. Such a vision of reconciled unity and diversity is rich and powerful enough to meet the speciously plausible challenge of populist extremism in a post-liberal world. That's what world literature can do. But I also said I'd mention what it cannot do. What world literature cannot do is legislate the effort it takes to read closely and cross-culturally. And that's why we as literary scholars still have a lot to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ken, for this enriching and enlightening lecture. I think we've tried to accompany you in this journey through world literature. I think many of us would need more time to digest all you've said about this and read more into world literature, those of us who are not well versed in literature. But I think you made clearly your point about the limitations of liberalism. The floor is yours for comments and questions. Patrick?
Birth, copulation, and death. That's all the facts to brass tacks. Birth, copulation, and death. Is that T.S. Eliot, I think?
I think so. I don't know.
At any rate, I actually wanted to sort of go back to your introduction and the idea that we begin with this rationalism in the late 17th and early 18th century, and all of these things seemed obvious. One of the things that seemed obvious was markets, universal. But one of the other things about the Enlightenment is that it's a process. It's just a beginning. Everything can be continually questioned. This is the whole point of the discussion, right? Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that another way to look at this is that what we call conservatives and liberals today both have their roots in classical liberalism. Yep. And but in classical liberalism, there is something that appeals to the left, which is the sense of equality and the sense of justice and these sort of things. But there's also something that appeals to what we would now call the right, and that is the primacy of property and of markets. And I think it's Federalist Papers where it said the first object of government is to protect property. We can't let things go crazy. It's natural that people, have different amounts of property, and this needs to be protected. So at least in the case of the United States, you can say, well, can we question that? Mm-hmm. or is that just something built into the nature of things? And so it seems to me liberalism has kind of assumed markets all along, and the whole world order that has come out of it, has assumed the rationality of markets and the unquestionability of markets, so that people say something, we can't even imagine a world beyond this, where markets are not, assumed and accepted by everybody. And yet, Native Americans lived without property. I mean, you didn't own a tree or land. There are examples of other societies that lived without this. In other words, is our liberal world really transcendent, or is it just one more kind of culture and civilization that has its own set of limits?
Yeah, I tried to argue that it's very much a historical phenomenon, the liberalism, and I like the idea or the example of Susan Stanford Friedman's idea of multiple modernities. We look at modernity as, well, it started in around the 16th century, and we have it till this day. Stanford Friedman does a pretty good job in a book of 2015 of looking at multiple modernities around the world, so that if we define modernity as a vortex of rapid change across a range of human endeavor, we'll find that there's a modernity in Mughal India, there's a modernity in Abbasid Baghdad, there's a modernity in Tang Dynasty China. In other words, one of the reasons I'm kind of trying to take a long view of things is to historicize precisely something like capitalism. Is it natural, or is it something that we can look at? And I think it's a useful process. This is a way of kind of trying to look at a real problem, one that is seeming to me more and more intractable, and try to look at it from other angles. And historicizing it would be one. Yeah. This project, by the way, this paper is a sketch of a work of my next major project. Hence, the broad sweep, and I was waiting for a question saying, you're going to reduce all of liberalism to the one phrase in John Locke. I mean, give me a break. And it's true. There's a great deal of reductiveness here. This is a project that is, or this paper is a sketch of a larger project that has to come.
Thanks very much, Ken, for the insight into that project, as well as into the huge world literature companion. It's a very stimulating framework, and Patrick, I found your comments stimulating as well. I might cycle back to them, but I wonder if you could comment on two ideas or reactions. One, you talk about plucking a phrase from Locke and building liberalism on it, doctrine of suspension. I wonder if you think there's any relationship between that sort of liberal concept of cognition and the literary idea of negative capability, and whether negative capability is another sort of...
from Keats, yeah.
Yes, Keats' phrase for Shakespeare's ability to be open to the other and to invite on the part of audience members attentiveness to those sort of modes of otherness.
I really like
and
that.
whether that might be a little sort of at least rhetorical connection between liberalism and world literature. The other really fascinating facet of your talk for me was the emphasis on Web 2.0 and social media as a change in the political landscape, even greater than the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's a really striking sort of way of putting it. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about why you think that change in the media environment globally is such an important political event.
Yeah, the idea of negative capability, I'm very grateful for that. I had forgotten Keats's famous point on the negative capability, and it fits. The reason I chose this doctrine of suspension is that, yes, it's just one little slice of Locke, but it also fits. It fits into the idea of the disenchantment of modernity. And the negative capability is another way of kind of setting up a space of freedom in which to think and to play with ideas. So I think negative capability is very commensurate with the idea of the suspension, doctrine of suspension. But so is, for example, Descartes' idea on what I call the disenchantment of the material world. It's the mind that imposes order on the universe, and all the things around us are mere content. And I find that a kind of nefarious reduction of content, a nefarious reduction of identities. And it's not I don't think it's a coincidence that identity is precisely the thing that is coming back with great force, because it has been reduced to mere content for so long in the modern world. I'm kind of going away from the idea of negative capability, but it's only because I think it fits very, very nicely in with the idea of the doctrine of suspension. And then the web, the question about the web 2.0, there's a Lebanese fellow, Milad Douehi, who works in France at the I don't remember what it's not CNRS, but it's one of the real highfalutin places, and he's got a couple of books that kind of made me think. I don't even have a cell phone, let alone do social media, but reading his books, I understood that this. What I will definitely call a revolution, the digital revolution, affects everything. And what I've tried to do here is to concentrate on how what we took for granted back in the 80s, for example, of the gatekeepers. If you want something, we have freedom of the press. Yeah, okay. How are you going to get your letter into your op-ed piece into the Wall Street Journal or into the New York Times? Well, you have to know people, you can do it. It can be done, but it was hard. And so I think that was an artificial kind of, from our perspective today, that was an artificial free press. It's there, but jump through those hoops to get yourself published. Today, it really is at the limits of human consciousness. I mean, as far as I can tell, anyway. I don't see where the gatekeepers, I don't know. You might know more about that than I do. Who are the gatekeepers today? If I want to say whatever I want, however mean-spirited it might be, I can do it, and I can find a following. That's for me. That's a game changer. Whereas the fall of communism, yes, that was a game changer too, but it was still the same. It was still a carbon-based universe there. We're now in a completely different world.
Let me ask you a question which is not as unrelated as it seems. This has to do with what the word liberalism evokes in the Arab world. I mean, you've looked into literature and you might know stuff that I don't know. But the word liberalism in the Arab world evokes the sovereignty of markets versus state sovereignty. That's primarily where people don't associate much liberalism with freedom, certainly not with equality or political participation, maybe in the post-Arab uprising, democracy. The people of the Arab world are yearning for a form of political participation. They call it democracy, ill-defined or not defined at all. Fine. So there's this use of liberalism as an domination of market economy. And there is another understanding of liberalism, which is probably has to do with the influence of French ideas. I mean, the word liberalism again evokes in France economy. Doesn't evoke the ideals of the French Revolution. Loin de là. The ideals of the French Revolution pivot around the autonomy of society through reason vis-à-vis religion.
Yeah.
That's the crux of the matter, and that's where laïcité in France comes from. French secularity, at least in terms of history of ideas, this is where it comes from. And much of the debate here is on this as well. The modernities that you've talked about, the modernity in the Arab world is primarily around greater autonomy of society vis-à-vis religion. So many of those issues are not present in the political debate. They may be in literature. So that's
well,
you're better equipped than I.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Tarek, for opening the horizon to the Arab world and actually continental Europe as well. I was keenly aware as I was putting this together that this was very much an Anglo-American sphere that I was working in because, for sure, liberalism, and I like the way you put it, has very much the economic resonance in France, and I'm learning now in Arabic. On the other hand, though, I do think there's a point of comparison in the idea of reason and the role of reason in both or all of these traditions that we're talking about. Reason is looked upon as the ultimate arbiter in questions of economics or in the Anglo-American world. And I'm as much as I think obviously reason, we're in an institution devoted to rational inquiry, and it's certainly a part of what it means to have full humanity. On the other hand, I can't help thinking that 3.5 billion people in the world are religious believers. And every time we walk into a university, we kind of try to forget that because, after all, these poor people, they don't know what they're thinking about. We do. And I really want to get away from that. We should be in the world as it is and not as we want it to be. And so I kind of think that this argument that or the discourse that you just mentioned, or the debate in the Arab world between rationality and religion, I hope I'm not reducing that too much, I think that's actually more healthy than kind of putting religion in a closet somewhere and saying, oh, those people, they'll learn someday. They're there now, and they're telling us we will not be silent, we will not be put in that closet. And so I think we have to take that on board.
Please. See 3 hands.
Hello. I read an article a few days ago about how books, when they want to get published in the US, they have to undergo proofreading by a person from a minority that proofreads for political sensitivities and ethnical comments like that. So can we say that political correctness is playing a role in censoring other ideas, excluding a part of the society that actually exists, but pretending like it doesn't, it's not there?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
That's a great question. I think it can be that. It can have that function, can't it? I mean, it can be a new kind of, ideological straitjacket for us. It can. I don't see why it can't. Okay. That being said, the rationale for the practice you're talking about is as a way of addressing long-standing structural inequalities that don't seem to be addressed by simply saying, hey, we all have freedom. So that's definitely a potential problem, but I think it's necessary to talk about both sides. Why do we have that ideological vetting going on in any kind of a publishing situation? Why do we have it? What is the rationale for it? How long should it, to what extent is it necessary? And one of the reasons I like the idea of this broad historical view going back to the Axial Age is that we can look at it not in terms of identities. Well, yeah, we know this fellow is of a minority, and so he's going to think that, or this person is, such and such, and he or she is going to see that. But rather, we look at it as a problem that exists throughout human history and around the world. And that kind of, to my mind, kind of takes the edge off of the contemporary harshness.
Ken, thank you very much.
Yeah,
I have a question. It seems to me that one thing you said at the beginning of the lecture is that, compiling, researching, teaching, and disseminating world literature, which is obviously what this project is interested in doing, can help combat violence and extremism. My question is twofold. First of all, there's an argument to be made that extremism has always existed, and that it's not a new facet of, 21st century, that. And then I didn't hear much about how it actually can go about doing so. How can violence, first, is it really new? Or is it an age-old phenomenon? And second, how can we as researchers and teachers help combat different forms of fanaticism, extremism, violence? You mentioned even depravity, pornography maybe, I don't know, which is a form of violence, via the corpus that we come to define as world literature.
Yeah, thanks for that question, because it's the talk had to stop at about 50 minutes, and that's exactly where I ended. The idea is that, yes, extremism has always existed. With Web 2.0, however, there's, at some point maybe there'll be firewalls put up here and there. But what I'm seeing now is a kind of proliferation of these specious arguments that support what I would consider extremist doctrine. In other words, simple solutions for complex problems. It's always existed. How does world literature? It doesn't curtail it. What we need, as far as I'm concerned, in a university is some kind of a compelling response that doesn't simply say, you say that and I say this and we're both on the same level. My sense is that through the reading of that poem, as an example, what we can do is to offer a richer, more complex, more humane way of looking at the world, that somebody seeing the simple certitudes of extremism and seeing what we do comes away saying, oh, that's really a ham-fisted way of looking at a complex problem. My way of looking at it is that poem, it's obviously a love poem, but it has this kind of complexity that I like, and that I think is, if we can be attentive to it, if we as educators can convey that to students, we will have given students the kind of strength or the kind of forceful discourse that can meet this, these extremist simplicities. Does that kind of?
So basically it helps them sort of recognize the flatness of other ways of thinking.
Yeah,
so it is to enrich and to complex ways of looking at the world and appreciating its nuances. And teaching world literature can help do that. That's, I believe, what you just said. Thank you very much. Basil.
Hello. I have a question about the process of selection of text and the projected audience, the audience that you had in mind, especially in light of what you have described in relation to the faster, different pace, basically, of access to information for the younger generation, as well as for basically people in general. And my second question is really, I'm really curious about the processes of selection that have informed approaches to anthologies of world literature from the non-centric, from the margins, basically. So countries such as China, something that's associated with more, Lebanon.
Yes.
Basically U.S. or Europe-centered, basically places. How is the process of selection that you are following different, similar to some of the more, some of the most prominent, works in the field?
Well, there's a difference between an anthology of texts, which you'll find in the Norton or the Bedford, these kinds of anthologies, and the companion, which is, these are original articles written by scholars on the various topics. But the idea of a criteria for selection is, this, as you might imagine, this took us the better part of 2 years to work through. And basically there were about 5 different elements that we took into account, no one of which was enough to bring a text into or bring a topic into the companion. But one of the most important was criteria was the idea of traveling, and this goes back to David Damrosch's point. It's just simply an empirical identification of a fact that, the Panchatantra, for example, traveled from India to China to Persia to the Arab world, where we have the Kalila wa Dumna written off it, and then into Europe, where Jean de La Fontaine did his fables. So that text traveled, okay, and so that would be one criterion. Then there was also the criterion of representativeness. We realized we're pretty much, despite our varieties, and we really do have quite a variety on the editorial board, we're all pretty much in the same club. And so we said, well, we're going to try to go beyond that, where we are. And so that was another criteria, is representativeness. As I mentioned in the paper, there were lots of places that we did not get to. We cannot do a text from every language, culture in the world. That would be silly, and we missed a lot. And then again, there are also some kind of crazy imbalances. What do you think? What do you think was the smallest country that had the most number of texts? I knew she would say Lebanon. But Lebanon actually did very well, but Guatemala has 2. The Popol Vuh, the pre-Columbian epic, and then Asturias, the great poet. Guatemala, whereas, we have, so there's a quirkiness about this, all right? We wanted ideological representative, variety as well. In other words, we don't want everything to be kind of, there are certain periods in history when you find an awful lot of, for example, national epics. So we had to kind of go beyond that a little bit. Let's move into mysticism, even though, maybe some of these mystical texts didn't travel all that much. Ideological, cultural balance, these were all concerns, but no one was really enough to kind of make make a text go through. So it was actually a complex process that I'm trying to distill down into just a few words here. And it was very much a debate, too. I mean, we had the protocols of the Elders of Zion until the penultimate version of the table of contents, and that was a Jewish fellow who wanted to keep it. This text is powerful. It has moved the world, and you know, keep it in there. And then finally he said, I don't think so. Maybe it's not a good idea. And I'm glad, you know, because I mean, he pressed hard for it. So, yeah. Sorry? Oh, projected audience, yeah. It's a worldwide distribution, especially oriented toward Asia. So the South Asia and East Asia are going to be, you know, primary markets. That being said, the rest of the world as well, but we were, you know, it was made very clear to us that it would be a worldwide environment. So, for example, silly things like just putting in, you know, a French phrase like we often do, especially in Lebanon. No, because we can expect our readers to know English. We cannot expect them to know laissez-faire capitalism or something. I don't know. Yeah.
Good. I think we'll leave it at this. We've had a good discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tarek.
A bientôt.
Thank you.